Just let it in.
It is my Nerd World of Star Wars show, and I am glad that you are with another episode this week. I am your host, Jon Justice, and got a lot of news to cover on this week's show. Again, including this talk of a new writer and a new Star Wars movie. When might we see Andor? Some Kenobi weirdness going on when it comes to the potential of Darth Maul being in the series. I'll dive into that in your listener feedback. Before we start, though, I wanted to make a quick comment about something. Reminisce a little bit. I was watching The Empire Strikes Back this week. I actually watched The Empire Strikes Back this week. Started watching it earlier in the week, and then while I've been diligently working on Book 7 in my EMBARK series, I just kind of had it on in the background. And I just finished watching it right before I came down to record this week's episode. And I got to thinking about the end of that film, seeing it for the first time when I was a kid. First off, it's interesting because I don't remember where I saw The Empire Strikes Back for the first time. I remember seeing A New Hope for the first time with my dad in Rosemead, California. I remember the first time I saw Return of the Jedi in the theater as well. We went out for opening weekend to Los Angeles to see it on one of the big screens there. That is an experience I'll never forget, not only because I was seeing Return of the Jedi for the first time, but because in the middle of the speeder bike chase, the film caught on fire, and there was a big pause in the middle of the speeder chase on Andor. So I'll never forget that. I don't remember, though, where I was the first time that I saw The Empire Strikes Back. I want to say that we saw it in a theater inside of a mall. That's the memory that I have, is going to a mall theater to see it. More specifically, though, and the reason I wanted to bring it up was just a little anecdote, and that is the end of that film. I'll never forget, and I think it had an impact on me and all my film watching moving forward, even now to being an adult. I'll never forget the end of the movie because this was the first time that I had seen a film that ended on a cliffhanger like this film had ended with The Empire Strikes Back. And I remember specifically thinking to myself, surely this can't be the end of this movie. I remember thinking, no, I know the music is beginning to soar and it's reaching a crescendo, but I can remember sitting there going, no, there has to be more. They're not going to end it on this, and then and then it ended, and then I was sad yet happy, right? It was a great film. It was emotional. It had depth in the way that the first film didn't. I've talked at length before about how The Empire Strikes Back was the first Star Wars film where we knew we were getting something special or expecting something special. Whereas the first time we saw A New Hope, just being Star Wars, we didn't really know what to expect. And then for every film afterwards, you have that feeling and that rush going into it that you experience, at least for me, every time you go see a Star Wars film. But I'll just never forget walking out just being so a bit flabbergasted as a kid, going, oh my gosh, how long do I have to wait until I see how can they not have, solve this problem of Han Solo frozen in carbonite? I'll never, ever, ever forget that. And it's one of those things when I'm watching films now that I still do, and that is not wanting if a film is really, really good, you don't want the film to end. And you don't get it nearly as much as you used to because films aren't nearly as good as they are. Or they're so long that even if you thoroughly enjoy it like I did the Batman, you're okay that it's ending because you've been sitting in the theater for 3 hours. But I just remember that with The Empire Strikes Back and how it kind of ended up affecting all my movie watching afterwards because I didn't want it to end, and especially not end on a cliffhanger. So there you go. Just a little amusing anecdote to start off the show this week. I just was watching The Empire Strikes Back, such a fantastic film, and I just remember thinking about that at the end. That first experience I had seeing that, and just how floored I was that they actually ended this movie on a cliffhanger like that. I'm just like, how could you do that? All right, so we got a lot of ground to cover. Let's go ahead and dive into the first bit of news for this week.
This is not going to go the way you think.
So Jeff Snyder used to work over at Collider. He tweeted out earlier this week this little tidbit. I'm hearing that Damon Lindelof, the creator of Watchmen and the co-creator of Lost and The Leftovers, is working on a new Star Wars movie. For those that aren't familiar with David Lindelof, he's worked on a ton of stuff. Sort of in my orbit, Prometheus, Star Trek, the newer Star Treks, tons of J.J. Abrams stuff he's worked on. Very well known within Hollywood. I was listening to the Sith Council with Christian Harloff earlier this week, and Christian, of course, used to work with Collider. Now he's on his own, and he knows Jeff Snyder personally, having worked with him at Collider. So he actually called him on the show to talk to him about it. Jeff didn't really divulge much else apart from he'd been hearing that Damon Lindelof had been working or was working on a Star Wars film for several weeks or months now. I guess he's also doing something for Peacock. I said he was sitting on the information for a bit because he didn't want to put it out there and potentially make a difficult situation for Damon Lindelof because, if he's working on a show for Peacock, do they also want to know he's working on a Star Wars movie? But he ended up reporting it anyways. The speculation that they kind of landed on, and it was a really interesting discussion that they had, was, well, what is he working on in writing? Is it an existing film that we've already sort of heard rumors about, or is it something brand new? And then they got into this discussion of what in the world's going on with Disney and more specifically Lucasfilm and their Star Wars movies. We're supposed to have this Taika Waititi film. Who knows when Rogue Squadron is supposed to be produced and released by Patty Jenkins? Kevin Feige is supposed to be working on a movie with the Waldron. I can't remember his first name. The Waldron writer, who I believe worked on WandaVision. There was another movie that was supposed to be in the works by the guy who did the film Slight, I believe. But none of this stuff has been confirmed. The one thing that was confirmed was, of course, Rogue Squadron, and then that got pushed back. But then we heard rumors that Patty Jenkins wasn't doing Cleopatra anymore, which is apparently the reason why she had pitched off from Rogue Squadron in the first place. So what in the world is going on with Lucasfilm and Disney and the Star Wars films? The one thing that I thought was most interesting about it, apart from Damon Lindelof, that's fascinating. He's a huge Star Wars fan. Apparently, the first time he ended up working with J.J. Abrams was because he met J.J. and Damon was wearing a Star Wars shirt, and I guess that's how those two bonded for the first time. The comment that they made that, again, I thought was most interesting was that given the success of the Batman in the box office, that while it's clear Disney is focusing on the streaming service and putting films out that they have a lot of faith in on the streaming service, and they cited Turning Red as the example. And I would argue that Turning Red I enjoyed the movie. I'm not going to get into it here. I've actually been pondering doing a separate podcast about it because it is kind of a controversial doing that thing with my fingers film. Didn't like the first 20 minutes, but once it kind of got rolling, the wife and I ended up enjoying it. It was weird though. But that's a film that I can see better served on streaming than a theatrical release. But given the success of the Batman, and before it, Spider-Man No Way Home, Jeff Snyder made the point that it looks like moviegoers are definitely going out to see tentpole films sort of, in quarterly fashion every 3 months or so. I think part of this is due to the fact that we're getting big major releases sort of spaced out this way. People are returning to the movie theater to go see big theatrical releases. But the fact that a film like The Batman that runs 3 hours long is still raking in as much money as it is heading into now its third weekend. And I even looked because I was going to take my wife to go see it, and the showings were getting filled up. It goes to show that there is, a market out there for theatrical releases, and I agree with the comments that Christian Harloff and Jeff Snyder made, and that is, Star Wars is still arguably the biggest franchise that's out there. So I really hope, and I've said this a lot, I hope that they get their theatrical release schedule in order and start pumping out theatrical releases. I love what we've been getting on the streaming services. Don't misunderstand, and can't wait to see Obi-Wan Kenobi. But to me personally, in my opinion, Star Wars is better served on the big screen. Speaking of the small screen, Bespin Bulletin, of which we have a lot of reporting coming from Bespin Bulletin this week. One of their reports, though, from Bespin Bulletin, talks about when we'll be seeing Andor. They tweeted out earlier this week that Ms. Marvel will kick off on June 8th, and apparently Andor will be the next tentpole Disney Plus series after Ms. Marvel. He went on to say, I always heard August, and I won't be surprised if it's still there, even though Ms. Marvel is coming slightly earlier than Disney had previously mentioned. So, could be getting Andor sometime around August, which would set the stage for Mandalorian Season 3 later in the year, probably again sometime towards the end of the year, about where they ended up putting the Book of Boba Fett. That still leaves in the wings the Bad Batch Season 2. My speculation is we should still get the Bad Batch Season 2 somewhere in there, probably after Moon Knight, which debuts here in the next week or so, and before Miss Marvel. And I don't see this report as being anything contrary to that, saying tentpole Disney Plus series. I don't see Bad Batch Season 2 being a tentpole Disney Plus series. It's a big deal for Disney, but it is, animated, and it is a Season 2 of the series, and so it's not, certainly not carrying the same type of gravitas as it did when it debuted last year. Speaking of which, I wanted to add something to this. I've been watching a bit of Bad Batch on top of doing a complete Rebels rewatch. And on a rewatch of Rebels, we're on Season 2 right now, watching it with my 15-year-old son, Kyle. When the Rebels meet up with Rex, Gregor, and Wolf in Season 2, this is the first time that I've watched Rebels since watching Episode 7 of the Clone Wars. Okay, I'm mentioning a lot of shows here. So, watching Kanan in the episode where they meet the clones of Rex, Gregor, and Wolf, watching Kanan speaking of the Jedi Purge, having the added context now of seeing what he went through as a young kid in Season 7 of Clone Wars. And on top of that, watching the Bad Batch Season 1, seeing their role in that same episode where we see Kanan as a kid in Season 7 of the Clone Wars, it really brings a lot of added depth to an already great series. And this is a point that I'll touch upon a little bit later on because I have another example of that coming up. And I really dig it. It really adds a level of enjoyment to these series that I already love. Now having the context of knowing and having seen what Kanan actually went through in that moment in time. It's just the interconnectivity of what they're doing with these series is really, really fascinating to me. And also to me sort of has me leaning more towards the reporting of Darth Maul potentially having first been the antagonist before Vader in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series as being bogus, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but it speaks specifically to that continuity. All right, a little bit more news. We have some Obi-Wan Kenobi news. There is a spoiler here. It's super, super minor, so this isn't anything that's really going to ruin the show for you, in my opinion, so don't pitch off if you want to remain spoiler-free. I mean, if you want to be completely spoiler-free, I'd skip ahead about 3 or 4 minutes. But again, this is more just specifically about a location that we're supposed to see. Star Wars Newsnet put this out earlier in the week. A Star Wars location first mentioned in the original film back in 1977 will finally be seen on screen for the first time in the upcoming Obi-Wan Kenobi series. Luke Skywalker to Obi-Wan Kenobi said in A New Hope, "Look, I can take you as far as Anchorhead. You can get a transport there to Mos Eisley or wherever you're going. We're apparently rumored to actually see Anchorhead in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. It was actually faintly seen from a distance in the first teaser for Obi-Wan Kenobi. Yes, Tashi Station is technically on the outskirts of Anchorhead, which, of course, we saw in the Book of Boba Fett, although it was repurposed a bit, right? I didn't see any power converters at the bar there. But Obi-Wan Kenobi will take us into the heart of Anchorhead as its main transportation hub. Again, in the Obi-Wan Kenobi trailer, we see Kenobi traveling among commoners to keep a low profile. He's on a local transport in one shot with the town and city in the distance with a central tower. We can confirm, Star Wars Newsnet says, that it is the legendary Anchorhead. We were told Anchorhead is more than just a local transportation hub, and that it's a focal point of the town is itself is a bigger transportation station than initially conceived. The tower you see in the photo can be compared to an air traffic control tower from major U.S. airports. When they see the show, eagle-eye fans might find some similarities between the look of Anchorhead and Los Angeles International Airport, LAX specifically. Since Anchorhead had only previously been referenced and never actually seen in Star Wars canon, the designers were granted free range to create the location from scratch, which they go on to say they hopefully continue to see in future stories. And again, I really do appreciate the connectivity that we're receiving with all this content. Going back to that line, I can take you as far as Anchorhead, right, that I mentioned a moment ago. It's especially poignant for a film like A New Hope, as it's the most sparse in terms of details of all the films. Having further context, like Rebels with Clone Wars and Bad Batch, again, always enhances my viewing experience when I go back to watch those movies. And so I look forward to seeing the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, spending some time in Anchorhead, and then going back and watching A New Hope at some point in time and hearing them talk about it, just like we hear Obi-Wan Kenobi talk about the Clone Wars, and now we have all of this reference to the Clone Wars that, at least for me, comes flooding into my mind whenever I see that scene when he's talking to Luke Skywalker in his home. All right, moving on. This was probably the biggest item of Star Wars news this week, now that we've kind of been past the Obi-Wan Kenobi trailer for a bit. It started with a report in The Hollywood Reporter. The story that I'm reading from here is, again, coming from Bespin Bulletin. They write, earlier today, The Hollywood Reporter reported that Darth Maul was originally set to be the main antagonist in the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. THR's sources claim that Maul was in position to be the lead antagonist and that Ray Park had already began active preparations for a live-action return of Maul before Lucasfilm made creative changes. So let me stop there really quick, because this has actually been debunked by one of the story group leaders, and we'll dive into that. And I've heard some other further reports saying that the story wasn't necessarily accurate. I personally think that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of all this. First off, I have a hard time believing that they would have done Maul at this point in time in the timeline based off of how Ray Park learns now. And this is a very minor thing, but Ray Park who played Darth Maul originally, he looks significantly different now than he did in the original series, and certainly looked very different in that brief holographic image that we saw from the end of Solo. And if you've seen any of the production photos of him, he's older. That's not to say they couldn't de-age him, but he definitely has a different look about him. That's a really minor, a really sort of minor reason why. I have much larger reasons why I don't think that he was ever seriously considered. But let me give you a little bit more from the Bespin Bulletin story. THR's claim that Lucasfilm made a creative overhaul, something that Kathleen Kennedy spoke about recently, which left Maul out of the series and brought Darth Vader on board. The overhaul happened in January 2020 when Kennedy hit the pause button, as she was concerned with the direction of the scripts, with the Lucasfilm president stating the reason was she wanted the series to be more hopeful. It had been previously rumored that the decision to overhaul the series was due to the series being too similar to The Mandalorian. However, THR claims do support the previous rumor and add to it greatly. THR's report says that Deborah Chow, the director, took the scripts written by Hussein Armini from Drive and 47 Ronin to the Mandalorian creators, Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni, who were concerned with Kenobi treading similar ground to Mando, something that was previously rumored. The duo reportedly pushed Chow to go bigger with the series, but ultimately the concerns made it to the Lucasfilm higher-ups, who paused production and began a rewrite on the series and hired Joby Harold, Army of the Dead, King Arthur, Legends of the Sword, for the job. THR doesn't add much. THR doesn't add much as to what the original script entailed, but that it saw Maul hunting down Kenobi and Luke Skywalker. They also report that Park was involved in stunt training and on set for pre-production, with some even claiming that footage may have been shot of Park. However, it simply could have been test footage. THR says that Maul was pushed out when Dave Filoni keyed in on a way for Darth Vader to return and also put a character he created, the Grand Inquisitor, into the series. The Hollywood Reporter added that a Lucasfilm source of theirs denied the claims of their other sources. Following the report, a Lucasfilm creative executive, Pablo Hidalgo, took to Twitter to deny the report, saying, "A brown sun rises, BS has been spilled." Now, Hidalgo's Twitter page is now currently set to private, but the screenshot of the tweet was captured by individuals over at Star Wars Newsnet. All right, so what's the truth here? Well, let's back up a little bit. I miss the days when we didn't have all this information. I really do. I think for the casual fans out there, they're not all that aware of any of this, so this really just comes down to the hardcore fans, and perhaps it's good for the fandom that we have these items to talk about. I mean, I'm doing my own show based off of this information that I'm sharing with you. I do miss those days, especially having grown up with Star Wars, where the information that we got was reserved to sort of the magazines that we received and that were coming out at various intervals before films. I'll never forget, and this goes back to reminiscing again, I will never forget going to the library near where I lived in the Arcadia Monrovia area of Southern California, and getting a magazine. And I don't remember which pop culture science fiction magazine it was. Might have been Starlog. But I remember twice. First, having a magazine, seeing the first images from The Empire Strikes Back as a kid. And I'll never forget, it's really weird too, I'll never forget one of the shots in the magazine was Luke sitting there with Yoda on Dagobah, and he's sitting on the ground with Yoda standing next to him, and Luke has his hand like tucked in his arm. And this might be memory confusion, but I remember looking at the photo looking like Luke's hand had been chopped off. And then subsequently, spoiler alert, it actually happens. I also remember seeing the first images for Return of the Jedi at that same library in a magazine and just being blown away by seeing the Death Star 2, which at the time as a kid I thought was actually the first Death Star. It just didn't explode all the way. I'll never, ever forget that. I miss those days. All right, back to this story. It makes sense that Maul would have been discussed, okay? But like I said, I honestly feel like the truth is somewhere in the middle of all of this. It may have been discussed, but probably never solidified. I'm personally glad they didn't go this route, even if it was considered, and this is the bigger reasons why. It would have potentially drastically changed the Maul arc, the Maul arcs in Rebels, especially given, spoiler alert, the final death of Maul at the tip of Obi-Wan Kenobi's lightsaber in Rebels, unless they planned on having Maul live in the Kenobi series. But again, now you've got a similar circumstance of what we're faced with Vader. So they would have had to have had Maul live in the Kenobi series to keep with the continuity. Otherwise, you have a standoff between Kenobi and Darth Maul, and then he kills him, and then that completely negates what ends up taking place in the Rebels series. Okay, so if Maul was considered, right? Again, it would either be Obi-Wan faces Maul, and they both live, or Obi-Wan faces Vader and they both lived. This is what we're kind of faced with right now. If they're keeping with continuity, if those are the two choices, both of those circumstances would have had to have had the antagonist living at the end of the series. Now, what's interesting is that it's almost easier to reconcile Maul living at the end of the series to keep the continuity with the Rebels than it is Vader, considering the previous Obi-Wan versus Anakin fight in Revenge of the Sith and the last Obi-Wan versus Vader fight in A New Hope. Which brings me to this point. All of this goes to say that the Kenobi series is really going to hinge on how they handle this Obi-Wan Kenobi Vader face-off, especially if they're doing it more than once. I tend to lean more towards those sources inside of Disney that are discounting this, and that this is bad sources that were kind of aligned with the Hollywood Reporter, or it's kind of somewhere in the middle. It reminds me a lot of, was Palpatine planned or not? And discussions probably were that for him to return in the Rise of Skywalker. Nothing maybe was ever put on paper, but I'm sure it was talked about. And a friend of the show, SheVP, has actually shared details of that being the case, based off of numerous conversations of all the content creators involved in the sequel trilogy. All right, so let's move on to some leaking stuff when it comes to The Mandalorian Season 3. But again, this is pretty easy speculation, however, for those events, so I don't mind getting into it too much. There are a few minor details about some characters that could appear that aren't necessarily, at least as far as I know, core to the story and should not impact your viewing experience. So if you want to remain completely spoiler-free for Mandalorian Season 3, then you need to skip ahead. If not,
the hyperdrive is leaking.
Bespin Bulletin has another report, and apparently we will be seeing the mines of Mandalore in the third season of The Mandalorian. Now, of course, this makes sense because Din Djarin, which we'll get into within the report from Bespin Bulletin, the only way for him to get himself back with Mandalorian lore and with the Mandalorian is apparently to go to those mines, which, as it was said by the Armorer, those were destroyed, or maybe it was Din Djarin that said that in the Book of Boba Fett in that episode. They were destroyed. Okay, so apparently 2 separate cave sets were constructed at the train yard in El Segundo where Mando films, and one of those sets had a blue screen on the ground in front of a river. The second one featured a black rock around the entrance and black sand or dirt on top and the bottom of the ground. There was also a backdrop being used to feature a mountain with snow on top of it for one of those locations. Din Djarin, Grogu, and the Armorer and Paz Vizsla were connected to these sets. The new report adds more details to the Mandalore scenes that they talked about in a previous report. Now, this report comes on the heels of Making Star Wars, who backs up Din and Grogu, the Armorer, and Paz being part of those scenes, and adds that Bo-Katan and her allies are also a part of these scenes. Bespin Bulletin can say that, indeed, Bo has filmed with this crew, and they saw this last week. The report adds to the cave with the blue screen set, with Making Star Wars reporting the blue screen is for the frozen lake. The report also adds that there was an older light-skinned man and an older dark-skinned man who are heads of the oppositional Mandalorian clans that are reluctantly coming together along with Bo-Katan and Death Watch. According to the report, the clans seemingly come together for a ceremony that takes place beneath the caves that they had reported on. According to the report, a purification ceremony of sorts takes place beneath the caves and features the giant pool, an Olympic torch lighting element, and drums playing. A natural assumption of these events is the purification ritual that takes place in the mines of Mandalore that the Armorer spoke of to Din Djarin in the Book of Boba Fett once he revealed that he removed his helmet, and others have seen his face. The report also adds that the Armorer hands Bo-Katan a torch, and the Mandalorians in unison begin chanting for Mandalore. Purely speculation, but it sounds like Bo perhaps becomes the ruler of Mandalore once again. Which leads me to speculate, I wonder if there's actually going to be a fight between Bo-Katan and the Mandalorian, in which Bo-Katan actually goes and takes back the Darksaber. The other interesting tidbit, kind of exciting, is that apparently a mythosaur actually shows up It awakens during the ceremony at some point and chases the Mandalorians, causing a lot of trouble and destruction before later being brought under control. The report doesn't specify if somebody calms it or rides it or if it's ultimately defeated, but the Mandalorians do take on the beast. The final tidbit on the report adds that in the cave set, an Imperial door was built, and behind those doors we find Praetorian Guards and the Mandalorian-inspired Stormtrooper helmets, which leaked online last week. So the last report we get to before listener feedback is this story of the Praetorian Guards, which has me really, really excited. Apparent set photos from the third season of The Mandalorian, they did get online this week. The most interesting were images that showed some red helmets, rumored to be linked to the Praetorian Guards. So, the images did not leak to Making Star Wars, but added to what they were told of filming that's been taking place in Long Beach, California. And at this location, Din Djarin is facing off against Praetorian Guards. Now, these would actually be the Praetorian Guards aligned with the ones that we saw in The Last Jedi. They added that their sources told them that the guards, rocking the same weapons from The Last Jedi, stood alongside red stormtroopers with Mandalorian-inspired helmets. Now, these Mandalorian-inspired helmets look way more Mandalorian. I mean, they look like red Mandalorian helmets. It's also worth noting that it was previously revealed by Dave Filoni that The Mandalorian would show the origins of the First Order, something that has been strongly hinted at, especially in the second season when we saw some botched cloning attempt that somewhat resembled Supreme Leader Snoke and Emperor Palpatine. Praetorian Guards appearing in the third season is definitely a surprise, to be sure, the story goes on to say, but a welcome one. It also leads one to wonder who or what the guards are protecting and raises some interesting questions. Are we going to see Supreme Leader Snoke? Please, 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 please. I want to see. No, I'll get to more of this. But please, please, please. Are we going to see a possible Snoke predecessor? These are some thrilling questions and ones that I can't wait to learn the answers to. I'm also left wondering, the report goes on to say, if these red stormtroopers are actually Mandalorians, and this development adds some very interesting thoughts to things that they've already seen being filmed as late for The Mandalorian. So, this takes me back to sort of the commentary, or the biggest commentary that I've had on the show apart from the news, and that is the interconnectivity. I really hope they do connect The Mandalorian Season 3 with the origins of the First Order, and that we get more context for Supreme Leader Snoke. There is a lot that they could do. I don't need it as a fan. I love the sequel trilogy. I buy the whole storyline of what happened with Supreme Leader Snoke, regardless of how it came about, regardless of who got fired to direct what film and when. I don't care. I completely buy the fact that Supreme Leader Snoke was a creation by Palpatine, because Palpatine had not yet found a physical form to which he could use in order to take over as the Emperor again, and therefore created basically an avatar in Snoke's, as we saw in The Rise of Skywalker. That being said, it's obviously been a point of contention for a large portion of the fandom. To have The Mandalorian show us the seeds of the First Order would be fantastic, and add that depth of context that I was talking about before, that I think could really, really, really enhance the sequel trilogy beyond what I already love. But also give us more of that context of the Emperor and Snoke. There's a golden opportunity here, and based off of Lucasfilm's examples of what they've already done, of which I shared earlier, I can totally see them doing this. So far, Lucasfilm has been making these connections that I have been wanting. I mean, the fact that we got Luke Skywalker in the Book of Boba Fett with specifically a Mandalorian centric episode, 2 of them, right? But specifically that one. I mean, if they're willing to bring Luke Skywalker back, show the origins of the Jedi Temple, to bring that interconnectivity to the sequel trilogy, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't see the sort of inception of the First Order and begin to see that transition. And you could be looking at a whole other series, and I don't know who you would base it on or what character you would base it on, and perhaps this is something that we end up seeing in Ahsoka, assuming that this takes place after right, the events of The Mandalorian Season 3, since it won't be coming out until next year. But there's a really, really ripe opportunity here to give us the, sort of do for the sequels what the prequels did for the original trilogy, and telling us and showing us how the First Order came about, whereas the prequels showed how the Empire came about. And who knows? I mean, maybe this is where we get a film wedged in. I would love to see that. Man, give me a trilogy between the sequels and the original trilogy that shows us, similar to what the prequels did with another central story tied in there. I doubt they're going to do that, but I could definitely see the live action shows being the opportunity, those that are set after Return of the Jedi, before The Force Awakens, providing the proper place to go and tell those stories. What do you think? I almost gave the phone number for the radio station and the show that I do. What do you think? TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. Leave a comment up on YouTube. Of course, always love to hear from you.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, got a few items chosen from this week's listener feedback. We'll start off with friend of the show, Irene Davis. So excited about Kenobi. By the way, you choking up a little at my commentary made me tear up too. I have told my friend about your podcast, but she cannot access the internet at present, but is looking forward to better days. So I can't wait for Kenobi. Loved the music score. Gave me goosebumps. Thank you so much, Irene, as always, for the feedback. I appreciate it. SheVP, friend of the show, said, thanks for the mention, John. When you were talking about the sequels and the comment about the decision to go from Rey Nobody to Rey Palpatine and the discussion around that, I remember reading this interview once where Ingrid Bergman, Ingrid Bergman, and she was discussing the filming of Casablanca. And she said she didn't even know how the film was going to end until they were literally ready to film it. And she said it was because they couldn't decide on which guy that she was going to end up with. Nothing wrong with last-minute changes. Poe was supposed to die in 7. Yep, and they changed that. It's a natural part of the process as the story evolves. Anyway, great show as always, John. Thank you, SheVP. I appreciate it. And lastly, JC Val 93 writes, I gotta say, this looks epic, Obi-Wan Kenobi. While watching this, I thought of the clips of Tatooine had a kind of biblical feel to them, maybe. Star Wars has always had the mythology and religious overtones. I'm not overly religious, but this trailer conveys that from what was shown, and it has a spiritual feel, I think. Yeah, for me, it's more of just the nostalgia part of it. I understand what you're saying, but Star Wars has always had those undertones when it comes to the Force, and I've discussed that on the show before. How you can make comparisons to many religions, including Christianity, which I adhere to. So, thank you, JC Val 93. I really do appreciate it. And that wraps up the show for this week. Before I let you go, I want to encourage you to support my Nerd World, the podcast and the show that you're watching on YouTube, if that is where you are taking in this week's content, by going out and purchasing a copy for you or or a friend of yours or family member of my EMBARK science fiction space opera series. The stars are within reach. Interstellar travel is now possible, and global corporations D Corp and Enercon have provided air and space flight to all humanity. But when an industrial accident inside D Corp sets off a catastrophic chain of events threatening all of Earth, the global evacuation begins. Amid the growing chaos, a group of friends, including Taft Guardia, Keith Amaro, and a ragtag squadron of pilots, discover a mysterious device. As the ruthless Sin Argam of D Corp, with an armada of starships at his disposal, attempts to exploit the disaster, Taft and Keitha realize that they alone hold the key to saving humanity from the tyranny of D Corp's evil leader. 6 books in total in the series right now. Book 7 coming out in less than a month. All available in ebook, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook, produced and narrated by me. Great for essentially all ages, 11, 12, all the way up to adults. I wrote them because I love science fiction, I love space opera, and I wanted to create my own universe and storytelling the way that George Lucas did. I was inspired to do so, and it's been an absolute thrill And nothing brings me more joy than when people read my stories and they too are able to be magically whisked away to an alternate future and read these stories of adventure and excitement and romance. So I hope you check the books out. Go to Amazon.com, search for EMBARK, Jon, Jon Justice, or go to mynerdworld.net, and you can hit the links there to pick up the series. A lot of different specials going on the ebooks. There's a box set of the trilogy that's available as well. So, again, I hope you'll support the show and pick up your preferred version for yourself or the science fiction reader in your life. And that wraps things up. We'll be back again next week with the latest round of commentary, reminiscing about Star Wars and news, whatever transpires throughout the week. As always, wherever you are, I hope that you are happy, that you are healthy, and you are safe. And I will talk again next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.